Seventh graders, here's your lesson number 7. Um, Starting with this, you should know this from last week. Sexual reproduction requires two parents, and that's what you see here. One parent pink, one parent in blue. They cross and they switch genetic information, and that results in kids that could be different as well. But the big thing is here we have a switch of genetic information, and they end up being different. You see this light blue box going over here around this pink circle, or you have this dark outline circle here going on this blue box. There's information that swaps during sexual reproduction. It requires two parents. Now, asexual reproduction is one parent that can create kids that are exactly identical to them. There's no extra genes or DNA added. There's no shuffling or recombination or added diversity. These parents make clones that become their kids. So how is that relating to albino squirrels? Well, use what you know about this sexual reproduction requiring two parents to pass on a recombined or shuffled set of genes to their kids, right? And so it asks you, what percentage of squirrels would you predict to have albinism? So I already gave you the idea that albinism right here is a lowercase letter f. Now that means that albinism is recessive, and it requires two of those traits. And you see right here in each parent, right, two of those traits in a parent to make them albino. We've talked about dominant versus recessive before. If we have two parents that are albino, they are going to have the same genetic information. How many of their kids would be albino? That's what you're going to put right into that little spot. Okay. This table here shows the number of albino squirrels over the population over time. We have a bunch of years here, and then we have a number of total total squirrels and albino squirrels. So the best way to figure this out is to take the total number of squirrels, which is 784, right? So we have that piece of information, and we know how many albino squirrels are in there. So we have 182 squirrels that are albino out of a total of 700 and what was it? 84. So we divide it by the total to get your answer, okay? So this year we'll have a different amount. We have 683, so some of the squirrels have died. 172 out of 683 squirrels will give you the percent that are albino. So that's kind of how you figure that out. Do that one for each one. It says, based on the data, what do you think albinism is? Do you think it's a more common trait in only squirrels population or just kind of normal? This slide, we've talked about Punnett squares in an earlier lesson before, but it just has you take a look at two parents here that are, in this sense, green and green, but they have a yellow pea pod child, or they could have a yellow pea pod child about 25% of the time. And that's because if you look at these parents here, these parents are hybrids. They have the green information and the yellow information, but because green dominates over yellow, they end up being green, okay? You pull these letters from the top down into each box below it. You pull these letters from this parent sideways, and what you get in each one of these boxes is a possible outcome. These are the possible combinations that parent number 1 and parent 2 can have. So take a look at these with hair color on this slide, and then your next slide, which is flower color, okay, and also eye color. Check those out. The next slide asks you, what do you notice? Do you notice anything about those? Write in what you notice. What do you wonder about when you look at those images and what's happening there and the patterns of inheritance? And what patterns do you actually observe in those images? Okay, so again, use 5 and 6. Analyze those. Take a really good look at them in order to answer these questions here. Okay. So in the next few slides, we have a few genetic problems that you can try and answer. There is another help video on how to do these Punnett squares. I will tell you, just take pieces of information that you know and write it down on this slide here. So the trait that we're talking about in this snake looks like a normal looking hognose snake is bred to a normal type female hognose. So we got normal and normal. 2 of the eggs end up being albino. So this is like our albino squirrels problem. How many of the parents are purebred or homozygous? So we go in here, we're talking about color of snake, right? We have alleles. The alleles are, let's use A for normal. and little a for albino. Now, why did I write the normal as a dominant? Well, here's the reasoning. These snakes give birth to an albino snake. They must have the information for being albino. That's the only way they can give that information to a kid, is if they actually have it. Okay, so I know that albino must recede into the background on these parents. It's there in them, but we can't see it. So normal dominates over albino. That's why I use these. Okay, now we know that at least 2 of the snakes end up being lowercase and lowercase. Okay, so little a. At least that. So one of these little a's had to come from one parent, and the other little a they get from their other parent. Because remember, you get 2 copies of a gene, one from each of your parents. So this individual who was albino had to get the little a from its parent number 1 and also the little a from parent number 2. Now here's the crazy thing, like both parents are normal, and in order to be normal, they must have the information for looking normal. So the other piece of information they must have is a capital A for being normal. And so right now you already know what the parents are. The parents are hybrids. They are big A, little a, and big A, little a. The order does not matter. Both parents are wild. You have figured everything out except for the answer where it says, how many of the parents are purebred? Well, none. They're both hybrid. If you need more help figuring that stuff out, there is another help video on how to do Punnett squares, but these are a few of them that you should try on your own. There's one on bearded dragons. There's another one on bearded dragons. One of them is the color of the bearded dragons. The next problem on slide 12 is actually the shape of the scales of the bearded dragons. And the last one's about little puppies. You can go ahead and attempt those. They all have, the next slide, a place for you to label out the traits, the alleles, what the parents are, and what the kids are. Some questions to answer after that. What's the purpose for doing a Punnett square or using it? It's really, really simple. It's to predict the possible outcomes of kids. Not only just the possible outcomes, but how many. What are the chances of getting those kids? 25%, 50%, 100%. Okay? Can a single Punnett square predict all the probability of every trait? Absolutely not. We have one trait at a time with a Punnett square. So like if we have all these different traits that we're looking at, every single trait that we're talking about, hair color, eye color, etc., we need more than one Punnett square to do that. Okay? And what's the difference between dominant and recessive traits? Well, hey, look, if dominants are there, they show up. So in this case, a dominant trait is present in mom and a dominant trait is present in dad. They show up. We know that they show up. If they're present, we see them. They get expressed. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, however, a recessive trait like this might recede into the background. We only see recessive traits if this individual is homozygous for recessive, meaning they have a recessive piece of information from mom and a recessive piece of information from dad. So this one here says the patterns of inheritance depends on whether the 2 parents are homozygous, that is, they have the same information, or if they're heterozygous for that trait. If a parent has 2 identical alleles for a trait, they are said to be homozygous, and you see that right here, okay? If a parent has 2 different alleles, they are said to be heterozygous, and you see that right there. I just highlighted it. Watch these 2 animations. So you can click on these and watch an animation, and then you type in here and you practice making the Punnett square with that. Okay? I would pick a letter like H that looks different as a capital letter and a lowercase letter. We've talked about why that is. Sometimes if you use the letter S and it's capital and lowercase, you really can't tell the difference between those two. So make sure you're using a letter that looks different as a capital and lowercase letter when you're practicing those Punnett squares. So check out both of these videos. They are linked there. You will need to log in to Rapid Identity. That's this page right here. When you go to Bloomington, it's got this kind of, Bloomington login page. That's so that you can actually get into the textbook, which is Discovery Education. You'll need to have that open in order, or logged in order to access these videos. Okay. Getting down to the last couple slides here. This one asks you a couple of questions. People who have one allele for widow's peak and one allele for straight hairline, they have a widow's peak. So that tells you that widow's peak must dominate over the straight hairline. Okay. Tells you that widow peak is the dominant one. That's what you need to know. Why? Because if they have both pieces of information, we see a widow's peak. It dominates over the other piece of information. What's the probability of having two heterozygous, big W, little w, parents? What is the probability of offspring of two heterozygous parents who have a widow's peak? Well, you would have 3 of the 4, which would be widow's peak, and then one of them, just 25%, would be not widow's peak. But you need to explain why. You know what? You can use some of these Punnett squares from before in order to kind of figure that out. The best one would probably be the one that we did together here with the 2 snakes. Just reword it so that it's not widow's peak and you're talking about snake color, and hopefully it'll make sense. On this slide here, you match the genotype, or sorry, you match the word to its definition. And if you need help with that, there's a link to the Quizlet right here. And my last slide here says, how could you apply what you know about Punnett squares and models of inheritance to explain how albinism is inherited in squirrels? Try to explain it below. Okay? So how do albino squirrels get their trait? Okay? Explain below.